My dad installed a thumbprint lock on my bedroom door for my protection after catching me cutting my own hair. When I asked him why he was really doing this, he gripped my shoulders until it hurt and whispered, "They'll kill us both if you ruin this." I stayed silent. That was 3 weeks ago. This morning, he was standing outside my school in tears. My father raised me alone after my mother left when I was 3. He maintained a strange set of rules that seemed protective as a child but served a darker purpose. The first few were simple. No sleepovers for safety, no social media for privacy, no photos anywhere. But it got worse. I had to walk with my head down, speak in monotone, never laugh loud enough to be remembered, and wear the same gray clothes every day so no one would notice me. Couldn't raise my hand in class, couldn't excel at anything, couldn't be bad at anything either. I was trained to just exist in the middle, forgettable. The worst part was the documentation. Things like morning saliva samples for hormone testing, voice recordings to track sensual development in my tone, temperature readings between my legs. He'd make me practice being touched without flinching, grabbing my arms, waist, neck to build tolerance. Said emotions caused impurity, so I couldn't cry, couldn't laugh, couldn't react to anything. At school, I was the weird girl who never talked, sat alone, ate nothing, stared at walls. When group projects formed, everyone avoided me. Girls whispered about my monotone voice, my blank stare, how I flinched when anyone got close. They stopped trying to include me by middle school. I wanted friends desperately, but couldn't form words he hadn't approved. I wanted to laugh at jokes, but my face wouldn't move. The isolation was suffocating. Teachers thought I was autistic or disturbed, called home about my concerning behavior, but Dad always had explanations. Anxiety disorder, social phobia, selective mutism. Around 15, things got stranger. Dad installed new locks on all the windows, security cameras in my room. He started giving me special vitamins that made me drowsy. He measured me weekly, photographed my face monthly, he said, to track how I was growing. Once I woke at 3 a.m. to a clicking sound, pretended to stay asleep. Through barely open eyes, I saw him standing in my doorway with a camera, taking photo after photo of me sleeping. Then he locked himself in his office. That's when I heard something I'd never heard before. My father yelling, actually screaming into the phone, desperate, begging. I'd never seen him show emotion beyond fear, but now he was sobbing between words I couldn't make out. When I asked him about it at breakfast, his whole body went rigid. "Bad dream," he said, not meeting my eyes. "You were having a bad dream." When I insisted I'd heard him yelling, he gripped his coffee mug so tight it cracked. "You're confused. The pills sometimes cause auditory hallucinations." But I knew what I'd heard, and the way he kept staring at me, like memorizing my face, told me something was up. It got more suspicious to me when people started knocking on our door. Dad had no friends, no family, but suddenly there were strangers showing up at odd hours. Old work colleague, he'd say with a forced smile, sending me upstairs. But his voice was different from them, submissive, scared. That's when I decided to find out what was really happening. Started by palming the pills instead of swallowing them, hiding them in my mattress lining. My head cleared for the first time in years, and with it came the ability to think, to plan. I waited for his patterns. Tuesday grocery runs, 2 hours. Thursday errands, 90 minutes. I'd been practicing with bobby pins on my bedroom lock until I could pick it in seconds. His office would be harder, but I was ready. That Tuesday, the moment his car left, I went to work. His office door took 3 attempts. Inside, I barely recognized the room. Papers everywhere. Not the organized documentation I expected, but chaos. Bills covered his desk, all stamped final notice in red. Foreclosure warnings from the bank. Credit card statements with numbers that made me dizzy. Then I found the medical bills, hundreds of them. Monica Patterson, oncology ward. My mother's name was supposedly Linda. These were dated 12 years ago, the same time she supposedly left. Chemotherapy costs, $340,000. Surgery, $180,000. Experimental treatments, $500,000. She hadn't left us. She'd died, and he'd been drowning ever since. Underneath were the loan documents, not from banks, from people with names that sounded fake. Mr. White, Mr. Black, Mr. Gray. The interest rates were insane, doubling every year. But it was the collateral section that made me stop breathing. Ava, female, currently age 13, virgin status guaranteed. Legal guardianship to be transferred at age 16 if balance remains unpaid. Adoption papers pre-signed. Regular documentation required as proof of asset condition. That's when I realized every rule, every pill, every measurement had been part of the agreement. He wasn't protecting me. He was maintaining their investment until he could sign over his parental rights. My hands went numb holding those papers when I heard the front door slam downstairs. Dad never came back this early from grocery shopping, but there was no mistaking his heavy footsteps on the stairs. I grabbed the old flip phone I'd found in the basement months ago and started taking pictures of everything. The loan documents, the medical bills, the adoption papers already signed. My fingers shook so bad I could barely press the buttons. The camera made a tiny clicking sound with each photo that seemed loud as gunshots in the quiet house. His footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs and I heard him call my name with this weird urgency I'd never heard before. I shoved the papers back on his desk, but one slipped sideways and I didn't have time to fix it. The office door handle started turning just as I slipped into the hallway. I made it to my room and threw myself on the bed, trying to slow my breathing as he passed by my door. Through the crack under my door, I watched his shadow pause, then move toward his office. The door creaked open and there was silence for maybe 10 seconds before I heard him curse. Actually curse. Something he never did. He knew someone had been in there. At dinner, he kept staring at me while serving the same bland chicken and rice we ate every Tuesday. His hands shook when he set down my plate and I noticed him glancing at the security camera in the corner every few seconds. I forced myself to eat the way I always did. Small bites, no expression, eyes down at my plate, but inside my brain was racing through escape plans, calculating distances to neighbors' houses, remembering which ones had had dogs that would bark, which ones worked night shifts. He didn't say anything the whole meal, but his breathing was loud and ragged. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while my brain worked through what I'd learned. My 16th birthday was in 3 weeks, which meant I had 21 days before those men came for me. I mapped out every exit in the house: the bathroom window that didn't lock right, the basement door that led to the backyard, the attic access in the hallway closet. I thought about the kids at school I'd never been allowed to talk to, wondering which ones might help if I could somehow explain what was happening. At 2 in the morning, I was still awake when I heard Dad's footsteps in the hallway. The next morning, I woke to drilling sounds outside my door. Dad was installing something, and when I opened the door, I saw it was a new lock, one of those digital ones with a thumbprint scanner. "For your protection," he said without looking at me, sweat dripping down his face even though it was cold in the hallway. I watched him test it 3 times, his thumb turning the lock from red to green, before he handed me my morning pills. I pretended to swallow them like always, but tucked them under my tongue, adding them to the growing pile hidden in my mattress when he left. At school, I sat in my usual corner of the cafeteria, but for the first time, I actually looked around at the other kids instead of staring at my empty tray. Lucas Martinez sat 2 tables away with his friends, laughing at something on his phone. He caught me staring, and instead of looking away like everyone usually did, he smiled at me. Just a small one, but it was the first real human connection I'd felt in years. During PE class, something inside me snapped, and I actually participated in volleyball instead of standing still like Dad taught me. My arms remembered how to hit the ball, my legs remembered how to jump, my body moved without the fog of drugs for the first time in forever. Dr. Miller, the school counselor, was watching from the doorway, and I saw her write something in her notebook. When I got to the parking lot after school, Dad was already there, his face white with rage. The PE teacher must have called about my unusual participation, because he didn't even wait for me to buckle my seatbelt before pulling out of the lot. During the drive, I saw him checking his phone at every red light, messages popping up from someone named Mr. Gray that made his jaw clench tighter each time. That evening, while he was in the shower, I snuck back into his office and opened his computer, which didn't even have a password. There was a folder on the desktop labeled Asset Documentation, Do Not Delete, and when I clicked it, my stomach dropped. Hundreds of photos of me sleeping, close-ups of my face, my hands, my feet, recordings of my voice from the morning tests he made me do, spreadsheets tracking my height, weight, measurements he took while I was drugged. I copied everything to my flip phone's memory card, my hands steady now with purpose instead of fear. 2 days after finding those documents, I stood in the bathroom with Mom's old nail scissors, grabbing chunks of my hair and cutting them off. Years of control fell to the floor in long brown strands. The result was choppy and uneven, sticking up in weird places, but it was mine, the first choice about my body I'd ever made. Dad wouldn't see it until morning, and I didn't care what happened then. I'm wondering what Monica Patterson really died from, and if those medical bills are even real. Seems odd that Dad would keep using a fake name for the mother all these years, but leave her actual name on documents in his office where Ava might find them. His scream at 5 in the morning shook the whole house, a sound I'd never heard from him before, raw and broken. I sat up in bed as footsteps pounded down the hall, and my door flew open so hard it bounced off the wall. He stood there staring at my chopped hair, his face going from white to red to purple, mouth opening and closing like a fish. Then he crossed the room in 2 steps and grabbed my shoulders, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. His whole body shook as he started crying, actual tears running down his face while he kept saying they'd kill us both, over and over. That was the first time he ever said there was a they, instead of pretending everything was normal. He dragged me to his room and pulled a wig from his closet, blonde and straight, nothing like my real hair had been. His hands shook so bad he could barely get it on my head, adjusting it 3 times before pushing me toward the mirror. The person looking back wasn't me anymore, just some fake girl wearing someone else's hair. He drove me to school in silence, checking the mirrors every few seconds like someone was following us. The second his car turned the corner, I pulled the wig off and stuffed it in my backpack. Dr. Miller was waiting at the entrance, which was weird since counselors usually stayed in their offices. She took one look at my hacked up hair and put her hand on my elbow, steering me away from the main hallway. Her office smelled like coffee and those vanilla candles teachers always have. I sat in the chair across from her desk while she closed the door and pulled down the little sign that said not to disturb. She didn't say anything at first, just pushed a notepad and pen across the desk toward me. My mouth opened to explain, but nothing came out. Years of training had locked the words inside. Instead, I picked up the pen and wrote one word in big letters: help. She read it, looked at me, then got up and locked the door. From her mini fridge, she pulled out apple juice and crackers, setting them in front of me like it was no big deal. But it was huge because nobody had ever asked what I wanted to eat or drink. I picked the apple juice, surprised I even had a preference after all these years. She watched me drink it, making little notes on her yellow pad. Around lunch, someone knocked and she let Lucas in, this kid from my history class who always sat in the back. He didn't try to talk, just sat in the other chair while I finished the crackers. After maybe 10 minutes of quiet, the words just came out in a whisper about how my father was going to sell me. Lucas didn't act shocked or confused, just nodded like he already knew something was wrong. Dr. Miller picked up her phone and started making calls, using words like immediate intervention and emergency custody. 2 days passed in a blur of staying in the nurse's office, eating real meals, and sleeping on the little cot they kept for sick kids. On the 3rd day, Robert showed up with a folder full of papers, demanding they release me for a family emergency. The secretary stalled him, saying she needed to verify the documents while her hand moved under the desk. I could hear him getting louder from where I hid in the nurse's bathroom, his voice carrying through the walls. Then I heard him on his phone, telling someone named Mr. Gray that I was just having teenage rebellion but the merchandise was still intact. Those exact words, like I was a thing he was selling. The bathroom door opened opened and a woman in regular clothes came in, but something about how she moved said cop. She found me pressed against the wall, trying not to throw up, and instead of following whatever rules she was supposed to follow, she grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the loading dock. We could hear Robert yelling at the principal while we slipped out the back and into her unmarked car. Once we were moving, I showed her the pictures on my flip phone, all the documents I'd photographed in his office. She pulled over after seeing the loan papers, her face going pale as she read about the asset and the transfer date. We ended up parked behind a grocery store while she made call after call to different people. Through the windshield, I watched normal families arguing about cereal and kids begging for candy, stuff I'd never done. A mom was letting her daughter pick between 2 types of cookies, and I realized I'd never been allowed to choose anything, not even food. The detective kept looking at me between calls, like she was seeing all the things I'd missed, all the normal kid stuff that had been stolen from me. The dashboard clock said 3:47 when she finally put the phone down and turned to face me completely. She pulled out a folder from between the seats and started spreading photos across the dashboard while explaining that the pictures alone weren't enough for immediate action. The court would need more than just documentation since I couldn't actually say the words about what happened to me. Years of training had literally made it impossible for me to speak about the abuse directly. My throat would close up and my voice would stop working whenever I tried. She needed another way to build the case. That's when my flip phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was Lucas from school saying my dad was there with 3 men in suits and not to come back. I showed Vasquez and she immediately grabbed her radio to call for backup surveillance at the school. She started the car and said we'd go to her apartment for now until she could arrange something safer. The drive took 20 minutes through empty streets while she kept checking the mirrors. When we turned onto her street, she suddenly stopped 3 blocks away and pulled out binoculars from the glove box. There was a black sedan parked right outside her building. She focused the binoculars and her whole body went stiff. She said it was Mr. Gray himself sitting in the driver's seat, which meant they'd somehow tracked us already. She backed up slowly and took side streets to get away without being spotted. We ended up at a motel first while she made calls to arrange a safe house. The next morning, we moved to a small house on the edge of town that the department used for witness protection. I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched, though. Something felt wrong about how easily they'd found Vasquez's apartment. I kept checking my pockets and bag but found nothing. Then I remembered my jacket, the one Dad always made me wear. I turned it inside out and felt along the seams until I found it. There was a small hard lump sewn into the lining near the collar. Vasquez cut it open with her pocket knife and pulled out a tiny tracking device no bigger than a button. Robert had been monitoring my location for who knows how long. She put it in an evidence bag and said we'd have to assume they knew about this location too. We stayed anyway since she had officers watching the perimeter. That night I tried to sleep but kept thinking about the tracking device and what else he might have done without me knowing. At exactly 2 a.m. the safe house phone rang. Vasquez answered on speaker and I heard my father's voice, broken and sobbing like I'd never heard before. He was begging me to come back, saying they had the papers ready and if I didn't return by tomorrow they'd kill him and find me anyway. He kept saying he tried to protect me as long as he could. Vasquez was recording everything while making hand signals for me to stay quiet. His voice cracked as he explained how it all started with my mom's cancer treatment. The medical bills were destroying us and these men offered to pay for everything. He thought he'd find a way out before the agreement came due, but the interest kept growing and now they wanted their payment. He described signing papers he didn't fully understand, thinking it was just about money, not realizing what he was really promising them. The call lasted 17 minutes before he hung up crying. Vasquez played it back twice to make sure the recording was clear. At 4:30 a.m. I couldn't sleep, so I went to the kitchen and dumped out my backpack on the table. I'd been carrying around 3 years worth of pills I never swallowed, hundreds of them hidden in the lining of my bag. I sorted them into piles by color and size while Vasquez watched and took pictures. She said this could prove long-term drugging, but we'd need the prescription records to show he'd been getting them regularly. Her phone rang around 6 a.m. and it was Dr. Miller calling about something she'd found. She'd been going through my school records and discovered years of medical excuses for my behavior, all signed by different doctors. The problem was none of these doctors seemed to exist when she tried to verify their licenses. It was a whole paper trail showing how he'd systematically isolated me from getting help. While Vasquez was still on the phone, my flip phone buzzed again with another text from Lucas. This time he said my dad had shown up at his house and his parents had called 911. Vasquez immediately called dispatch to send units there while Lucas's family was already filing a restraining order. This created an official record of Robert's behavior getting worse. I suddenly remembered something about the security cameras in my room. They weren't just recording to the device. They were streaming to a cloud server that Robert checked from his phone. I knew the password because I'd watched him type it so many times. Vasquez got her laptop and I logged into the account. There were thousands of hours of footage going back years. Videos of him measuring me, photographing me while I slept, and worst of all, recordings of his phone calls where he discussed my development with the men he owed money to. The prosecutor arrived within an hour and set up the recording equipment in the interview room while I sat there trying to steady my breathing. She pressed the red button and asked me to state my name for the record. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. Talk about finding the world's worst Easter egg. A tracking device sewn into your jacket by dear old dad makes those helicopter parents look positively hands-off. Nothing says I care quite like secret surveillance technology. Tried again and felt my throat close up completely. The words were right there in my head, but my body wouldn't let them escape. 16 years of training had created walls I couldn't break through. The prosecutor tried different approaches for 2 hours. She asked yes or no questions I could nod to. She had me point at written statements. Nothing worked when that recorder was running. My father's voice kept echoing in my head about staying silent and being forgettable. The prosecutor finally turned off the machine and told Vasquez without my testimony, the trafficking charges wouldn't stick. click. That's when Lucas walked through the station doors with his parents. His mom was still in her hospital scrubs from her nursing shift. Lucas told them he wanted to testify about everything I'd told him at school. While he gave his statement, his mother kept watching me. She pulled Vasquez aside and started listing symptoms she recognized. The hand tremors I couldn't control, the way my pupils stayed dilated even in bright light, how I kept zoning out for seconds at a time. She said it looked like long-term benzodiazepine withdrawal combined with conditioning responses. Day 5 came with Vasquez getting a warrant for my father's financial records. The bank statements showed a disaster spread across 15 years, 3 mortgages on our house, his retirement accounts emptied, credit cards maxed and defaulted. Then the paper trail led to shell companies with names that meant nothing: Sunrise Holdings, Eastern Imports, New Horizon Investments, all owned by the same parent company traced back to Mr. Gray. Each loan document got worse than the last. Interest rates that started at 30% and doubled yearly. By noon, my father showed up at the station with a lawyer in an expensive suit. They had paperwork claiming I was mentally ill and needed immediate psychiatric treatment. The documents were signed by a doctor, Robert, diagnosing me with severe schizophrenia and recommending immediate hospitalization. Vasquez ran the doctor's name and found no medical license in any state. The hospital they wanted to send me to was called Peaceful Meadows Wellness Center. It sounded nice until Vasquez dug deeper. The facility was owned by another shell company connected to Eastern Imports. The address was a converted warehouse 40 miles outside town. No medical certifications, no state oversight. 3 girls had been admitted there in the past 2 years, and none had been seen since. Their families had been told they were transferred to long-term facilities overseas for specialized treatment. I grabbed a pen and started writing everything I couldn't say out loud. 20 pages filled up fast. The saliva samples every morning, the temperature readings between my legs, how he'd grab my arms and neck to build my tolerance, how he photographed me sleeping, how he measured me weekly. My handwriting started neat and controlled like always, but got messier with each page. By the end, I was pressing so hard the pen tore through the paper. That's when the security guard rushed in saying something was happening in the parking garage. We crowded around the monitors and saw Mr. Gray walking toward the entrance with 2 other men. They weren't trying to hide anymore. They walked right up to my father's lawyer, who was smoking by his car. The lawyer reached into his briefcase and handed over a manila folder. Vasquez zoomed the camera and we could see official adoption papers with tomorrow's date already filled in. The station went into immediate lockdown. Officers blocked every entrance while we watched Gray and his men calmly walk back to their black SUV. The adoption papers had Judge Whitfield's signature at the bottom. Vasquez pulled his record and her face went white. 17 adoptions in 5 years. All teenage girls between 14 and 16. All adopted by foreign nationals who left the country within days. The paperwork always claimed the girls were troubled teens whose parents couldn't handle them anymore. Every case was sealed for privacy. At 2 in the morning on day 6, I was looking through the case files Vasquez had pulled. One photo made me stop breathing. A girl named Grace who looked just like me. Same long dark hair, same thin build, same dead eyes from years of pills. Her adoption was finalized 3 months ago to a businessman from Moldova. That could have been me, came out as a whisper before I even realized I was speaking. The door burst open and Detective Vasquez walked in with someone new, a woman in a dark suit who moved like she owned the building. She pulled out an FBI badge and introduced herself as Agent Diana Powell, said the case was now federal because of the interstate trafficking evidence they'd found. She sat across from me and pushed a laptop forward, told me to type if talking was too hard. My fingers found the keys and words started pouring out, everything I'd never been able to say filling the screen while she read over my shoulder. Lucas's mother showed up the next morning with a stack of medical files. Nancy Martinez was an ER nurse who'd been documenting every time she'd seen me at school events looking drugged. She testified to the county prosecutor about the symptoms she'd observed: dilated pupils, slurred speech, delayed reactions, all consistent with long-term sedative use. She filled out paperwork to be my temporary medical guardian during the investigation, said she couldn't stand by while I had nowhere safe to go. The judge approved it that afternoon, and suddenly I was riding to Lucas's house in their minivan, watching normal kids argue about who got the front seat. At dinner that night, I sat frozen while his little sister threw peas at his brother, and his dad told bad jokes and his mom laughed so hard she snorted milk through her nose. They were loud and messy and interrupted each other constantly, and it felt like watching Aliens, like some nature documentary about a species I'd never encountered. Dr. Brown from school came to the courthouse the next day with 13 years of standardized test results, spreading them across the conference table to show the pattern. My scores were always exactly average, never varying by more than 2 points, which was statistically impossible for any real student. She'd highlighted sections where I'd clearly known advanced answers, but chose simpler wrong ones instead, following Dad's rules about staying unmemorable. Day 7 came and the prosecutor rushed in saying Robert had made bail. Someone wired $200,000 from an offshore account in Cyprus. Within 3 hours, he was on Channel 9 crying into a tissue, telling everyone how the police had kidnapped his daughter and turned her against him. He showed baby pictures of me with Monica, talked about how hard it was raising me alone after she died, how I'd always been troubled and the authorities were taking advantage of my mental illness. The next morning, every local station ran his interview. Then the national shows picked it up, and suddenly my face was everywhere with the headline, "Father Fights for Troubled Daughter." I watched from the Martinez living room as he sobbed on Good Morning America, saying I'd been manipulated by a corrupt detective who wanted to make a name for herself. Lucas sat next to me on the couch and pulled out his phone, said it was time I existed online for real. He made me an Instagram account, and within minutes, people from school started following. Kids I'd never talked to were suddenly sharing memories. "I always wondered why you looked so scared," one girl wrote. "I tried to be your friend in 3rd grade, but you ran away," wrote another. "My mom said you were being abused, but nobody listened, from a boy in my chemistry class. The comments kept coming, hundreds of them. All these people who'd seen something was wrong, but didn't know how to help. That's when Agent Powell burst through the door with her phone out, showing us a legal filing that had just been submitted. Mr. Gray's lawyer was demanding immediate custody enforcement, claiming Robert had signed the transfer documents months ago, and they had papers with my signature agreeing to the adoption. The documents looked real, had my name written in what looked like my handwriting, but I'd never seen them before. Powell made calls frantically, trying to get an emergency injunction, while Nancy held my shoulders and told me to breathe. The next morning, Powell came back with a thick folder and a grim expression, said her team had been digging into Mr. Gray all night. He wasn't one person, but a role that got passed around, and the current one was actually someone named Victor Kozlov, who Interpol had been hunting for 5 years. He'd trafficked girls across Eastern Europe before moving his operation here, using the same method each time, finding desperate fathers with massive debts and daughters to trade. Day 8 arrived, and Nancy drove me to meet Dr. Jennifer Park, a woman with soft eyes who specialized in trafficking survivors. She explained that my inability to speak wasn't weakness or fear, it was programmed psychological conditioning from years of training. Every time I tried to form words that weren't pre-approved, my throat would close because my brain had been rewired to see speech as danger. She said it would take time to undo, maybe years, but it could be fixed. The FBI seized more computers from Dad's house that afternoon and found encrypted folders full of correspondence with multiple Mr. Grays going back 12 years. The emergency custody hearing happened 3 days later at the courthouse downtown, and I sat in the front row trying to keep my hands from shaking while lawyers shuffled papers and whispered to each other. The room was packed with people I didn't recognize, reporters with notebooks, social workers with folders, but then I saw him sitting in the back corner, and my whole body went cold. It was the man from the photos I'd found hidden in Dad's desk drawer, the ones labeled Mr. White in Dad's handwriting, and he was staring right at me with this small smile that made my skin crawl. Strange how Robert got bail money from Cyprus right when things started falling apart. Makes me wonder who's really pulling strings here and why they're willing to risk exposure now. The timing of Mr. I grabbed my phone and started typing as fast as I could to the FBI agent who'd given me his number, telling him about the man in the gray suit sitting 3 rows behind the prosecutor, describing the scar on his left cheek and the gold watch he kept checking. The agent texted back immediately that they were already in position, and I noticed 2 men in the gallery shift slightly, moving closer to the exits while trying to look casual. Dad took the stand wearing his best suit, the one he saved for parent-teacher conferences, and started talking in this calm, reasonable voice about how I'd been talking to strangers online who'd filled my head with lies. He pulled out a stack of papers, medical records, he said, showing years of psychiatric treatment for paranoid delusions and violent outbursts that never happened. His lawyer held up fake doctor's notes claiming I'd been diagnosed with everything from schizophrenia to borderline personality disorder, painting me as this dangerous, unstable girl who needed immediate hospitalization for my own safety. The judge was nodding along, writing notes, and I could feel the room turning against me as Dad described fictional episodes where I'd attacked him or threatened to hurt myself. When they finally called me to respond, I stood up and couldn't make any words come out for what felt like forever, just standing there with everyone staring while my throat closed up the way it always did. Lucas and his parents were watching from the second row, his mom giving me this encouraging nod, and finally I forced out the only sentence that mattered. My name is Ava Patterson, and my father has been selling me since I was 3 years old. The courtroom exploded into chaos with people shouting and the judge banging his gavel, but the FBI agents were already moving, one of them pulling out handcuffs while announcing federal trafficking charges against Dad right there in front of everyone. They arrested the judge too when sealed indictments got opened, showing he'd been taking bribes to approve custody transfers for other girls over the past decade. Over the next few weeks, the FBI uncovered this whole network of family court judges across Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri who'd been rubber stamping adoptions and custody changes for the trafficking ring. My case became the key that unlocked everything because Dad had kept such detailed records, thinking they'd protect him but actually providing evidence of the whole operation. Lucas's family took me in temporarily while everything got sorted out, and his mom Jennifer started teaching me basic things I'd never been allowed to learn. We went to Target and she let me pick out my own clothes for the first time, standing in the dressing room crying because I didn't know what size I wore or what colors I was allowed to like. At restaurants, I'd freeze when the waiter asked what I wanted because Dad had always ordered for me, telling them I had dietary restrictions that didn't exist. Every small choice felt huge after 16 years of having no choices at all, like learning to be a person from scratch. The FBI kept finding more evidence on Dad's computers, encrypted folders full of emails going back to when Mom first got sick, showing how the creditors had found him through the hospital's billing department. The messages showed Dad trying to refuse at first, saying he'd find another way to pay, but they kept raising the interest and adding penalties until he had no choice but to agree to their terms. They'd coached him on exactly how to raise me, sending detailed instructions about the pills, the documentation, the behavioral training, turning me into exactly what their buyers wanted. Jennifer helped me record a video testimony since I still couldn't talk properly in front of strangers, setting up a camera in their living room where I felt safe enough to describe everything. I talked about the touching exercises where Dad would grab me without warning to make sure I wouldn't flinch when strangers did it, the way he'd measure my body every week and photograph me from every angle. I explained how he'd trained me to never show emotion, making me practice keeping my face blank while he yelled at me or showed me scary videos, punishing me if I even blinked too much. The video went on for 3 hours, every detail I could remember about being groomed for sale, and the FBI said it was the strongest evidence they'd ever seen in a trafficking case. Then Dad's lawyer did something that made everything worse, released releasing all my medical records to some blogger who posted them online with my full name and address. The fake psychiatric diagnoses were mixed in with real medical information, shots I'd gotten as a kid, dental records, everything, and suddenly everyone on the internet had opinions about whether I was telling the truth. Protesters showed up outside Lucas's house holding signs, some saying I was a brave survivor, others calling me a liar who was destroying an innocent man's life. News vans parked on the street and reporters knocked on the door at all hours, forcing Jennifer to call the police just to get them to back off. The prosecutor's office sent 2 officers to escort me through the back entrance of the courthouse on day 12 when Nancy took the stand. She held up medical charts showing my vitamin D levels were so low, the doctors couldn't believe I could walk. My muscles had gotten so weak from years of sitting still that climbing stairs left me shaking. The courtroom went quiet when she described finding scars on my arms from the blood samples Dad took every week. She showed photos of my room with the locks on the windows and explained how the pills he gave me matched sedatives used in hospitals. The judge kept writing notes as Nancy listed everything wrong with my body from living that way for 13 years. Meanwhile, the FBI had been tracking Dad's contacts and found Victor trying to board a plane to Romania with a fake passport. They grabbed him at the gate, but surveillance footage showed 2 other men from Dad's meetings still watching my old school. Lucas set up a laptop in his room that afternoon and showed me how to make a private social media account with a fake name. He helped me find support groups for trafficking survivors, and I spent hours reading posts from girls with stories just like mine. One girl described the same rules about walking with her head down and wearing gray clothes. Another talked about her dad measuring her and taking photos every month. Dozens of them mentioned the vitamins that made them tired and the blood tests their parents claimed were normal. The FBI agent called Jennifer the next day with news about the money trail they'd been following. The loans weren't from regular criminals, but from a company that looked legitimate on paper. They'd been offering desperate parents money for cancer treatments and other medical emergencies, with contracts that used their kids as collateral if they couldn't pay. Dad wasn't the only parent who'd signed away custody rights, thinking they'd somehow find the money before the deadline. Day 14 came, and for the first time since moving in with Lucas's family, I woke up without checking the corners of the room for cameras. I went to the kitchen and made eggs instead of the cereal Jennifer had set out, choosing what I wanted to eat for breakfast without asking permission. The FBI tech team had finally cracked the password on Dad's cloud storage that same morning and found hundreds of audio files. The prosecutor played one in court where Dad discussed my market value and negotiated prices based on my virginity status. His voice sounded different in the recordings, like a salesman talking about a product instead of his daughter. They had him on tape planning the exact date of my 16th birthday transfer and discussing backup plans if I tried to run. Dr. Davis testified the next day about how Dad had systematically destroyed my ability to resist trafficking. She explained how preventing me from excelling at anything kept me from developing confidence or independence. The social isolation meant I had no support network to turn to for help. The constant monitoring taught me that privacy didn't exist and resistance was pointless. She called it psychological conditioning, designed to create a perfect victim. That's when the prosecutor got a call that changed everything. Mr. Black, one of Dad's main creditors, had been arrested in Chicago and wanted to make a deal. He gave them addresses of 12 houses where other girls were being prepared for sale just like I'd been. FBI teams hit all 12 locations within hours and found girls ranging from 8 to 15 years old living under similar restrictions. I met one of them, Lily, at the Victim Services Center 2 days later. She was 18 now and had escaped her situation 2 years earlier when her dad died of a heart attack before her transfer date. She showed me photos from her new life at college and talked about her boyfriend who knew her whole story and loved her anyway. The prosecutor spent day 16 building a RICO case that would treat the whole network like the mafia, using my evidence as the foundation to take down everyone involved. Day 17 started with me sitting in a small room with 3 cameras pointed at my face while the prosecutor explained how the closed-circuit testimony would work. My hands shook as I typed answers on the laptop they gave me since speaking out loud still triggered the programming Dad had drilled into me for years. The grand jury watched from another room as I described the morning saliva collections, the weekly measurements, the photos of me sleeping, everything I'd been trained not to talk about. When they asked about the touching exercises, my throat closed up completely, and I had to type while the prosecutor read my words aloud. 2 hours of questions left me exhausted, but the prosecutor said my testimony gave them what they needed. That afternoon, a woman showed up at the Victim Services Center claiming to be Robert's mother, who I'd never known existed. She brought a box of letters Robert had written her over the years, starting when Monica first got sick, and continuing through all the treatments that drained their savings. So Robert's mother shows up with a box of letters like she's delivering the world's most depressing time capsule. Nothing says family reunion quite like written proof of your son's slow descent into human trafficking. The letters showed how desperate he'd become, begging her for money she didn't have, describing experimental treatments that cost more than most people's houses. She cried reading them to the prosecutor, saying she'd cut contact with Robert 15 years ago because of his gambling problem, but had no idea what he'd turned into. The prosecutor added the letters to the evidence pile, showing Robert's descent from desperate father to someone willing to sell his own daughter. Day 18 brought a surprise when the school district approved my enrollment under protective custody guidelines, meaning I could finally attend regular classes with security measures in place. Lucas met me at the entrance that first morning with 5 other kids from my old classes who'd heard about my story through the news coverage. They formed a circle around me in the hallway, not talking much but making sure nobody bothered me or asked uncomfortable questions. In English class, the teacher didn't call on me even though I knew the answers, understanding I wasn't ready to speak in front of everyone yet. At lunch, the group sat with me in the corner of the cafeteria, Lucas on one side and a girl named Amy on the other, creating a buffer zone phone while I picked at my sandwich. The normalcy felt strange after years of isolation, but for the first time, I didn't feel like the weird girl nobody wanted near them. Everything changed that afternoon when the transport van carrying Robert to his court hearing crashed into a concrete barrier at 60 miles per hour. The guards found him unconscious with his seatbelt wrapped around his neck and a confession note stuffed in his shoe describing how he'd planned it all. The note admitted everything: the debt to Mr. Gray's network, the grooming protocols, the documentation requirements, but claimed he'd been trying to protect me by delaying the transfer as long as possible. He wrote that other fathers in the network had handed over their daughters at 14 or even younger, but he'd negotiated for my 16th birthday to give me more time. The suicide attempt failed when paramedics revived him after 8 minutes without oxygen, leaving him brain damaged but alive enough to face charges. His confession note became the prosecution's strongest evidence since it contained names of network members he hadn't revealed before, including 3 judges and a state senator who'd been customers. The FBI used those names to coordinate raids across 5 states the next morning, breaking down doors at 4 a.m. and finding 4 other girls in various stages of the same grooming process I'd endured. One was only 11, already on the same pills that had kept me drowsy for years, her father's office full of the same loan documents with her name as collateral. Another was 15 and scheduled for transfer in 2 weeks, her bags already packed with the gray clothes they'd been told to bring. The youngest was 9 and had just started the touching exercises, her mother recording everything on a camera identical to the one they'd found in Robert's office. Seeing their faces on the news made me realize my case had saved them from years more of what I'd been through. 3 days later, Jennifer drove me to the hospital where Robert was handcuffed to his bed with machines beeping around him. I didn't plan to speak, but stood in the doorway watching him struggle to focus through the brain damage while Jennifer waited in the hallway. His eyes found mine and filled with tears, but I just pulled Monica's photo from my pocket, the one from her healthy days before the cancer, and set it on his bedside table. He tried to say something, but the words came out jumbled, and I left before he could form a sentence, knowing that photo would remind him of who we'd both lost and what he'd chosen to do about it. The financial forensics team spent the next week tracking the network's money trail, finding over 200 families across the country who'd signed similar agreements with their children as collateral for medical debts. Some were still making payments, desperately trying to keep their kids safe, while others had already lost their children to the network when they couldn't pay. The investigators found offshore accounts with millions in profits from selling these kids to wealthy buyers who thought they were adopting orphans or hiring domestic help. Each family's story looked like ours: a medical crisis, impossible bills, and predators who knew exactly when to offer a solution that seemed like the only option. Jennifer helped me write my victim impact statement over 3 sessions, each paragraph sending me into panic attacks as I tried to put into words what those 13 years had taken from me. The first session ended after 2 sentences when I started hyperventilating at the memory of the morning inspections. The second session got further, but I threw up when I wrote about the photos and had to go home early. By the third session, I managed to complete 5 pages describing not just what Robert did, but what I'd lost, the friendships I never made, the laughter I'd trained myself to suppress, the normal childhood that had been stolen and sold before I even understood what was happening. On day 20, the judge called a special hearing where Lucas's parents stood before the court offering to be my foster family until I turned 18. His mom held my hand while his dad explained how they'd prepared a room for me and already enrolled me in therapy with a specialist who worked with trafficking survivors. The courtroom was packed with social workers, prosecutors, and reporters, but all I could focus on was Lucas's little sister in the front row holding a handmade sign that said, "Welcome home, Ava," with purple glitter letters. The judge approved the placement immediately, saying it was the first good thing to happen in this case, and suddenly I had something I'd never imagined possible: a real family who wanted me not as an investment or obligation, but just because they cared. 3 weeks later, the trial started in the federal courthouse downtown, with Robert sitting at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. He stood when the judge asked for his plea, his voice cracking as he said guilty to all charges, but his lawyer immediately started talking about coercion and threats. The prosecutor stood up with a laptop and played recordings from Robert's phone, his voice negotiating my virginity status and delivery date with Mr. Gray like I was a package. The courtroom went silent as everyone heard him promise to keep me pure and compliant, to maintain documentation, to ensure I'd be ready for transfer. His lawyer sat down without another word. The next day, they played my video testimony on the big screen, and I watched from a separate room as the gallery saw everything. They heard me describe the morning saliva samples, the temperature readings between my legs, the way he'd grab my neck to build tolerance. Several people left the courtroom when I explained how he'd photograph me sleeping and measure my body weekly for their records. The defense lawyer tried to suggest I was making things worse than they were, but Dr. Miller took the stand with 13 years of school files. She showed report after report from teachers worried about my blank stare, my monotone voice, my inability to make friends or laugh or react to anything. She read notes from kindergarten through high school showing how a bright, curious child had been systematically turned into a ghost who couldn't even raise her hand in class. The defense had nothing to say after that. On day 3, Victor took the stand claiming he had diplomatic immunity as a foreign businessman, but the FBI agent pulled out passport records showing he'd entered on fake documents. His real name wasn't even Victor. It was Paul Henderson from Detroit, and he'd been running this trafficking network for 15 years using different identities. The jury left to deliberate after closing arguments, and we waited in a small room eating vending machine snacks and checking our phones every few minutes. 3 hours later, they came back with guilty verdicts on everything: trafficking, child abuse, conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, and more charges I didn't even understand. Robert's face didn't change as they read each guilty verdict, just stared at the table like he he was somewhere else entirely. At sentencing 2 weeks later, I read my impact statement to the court, my hands shaking but my voice getting stronger with each word. I told them about the years of isolation, the pills that kept me drowsy, the way I'd been trained to be invisible and forgettable. I explained what it felt like to discover my whole life was collateral for a debt, that my own father had signed papers promising my virginity to strangers. The judge gave Robert life without parole, and as the guards led him away, he turned and mouthed something that looked like sorry. I looked straight through him like he'd taught me to look through everyone else, because his apology meant nothing after 13 years of selling my childhood. That night, the Martinez family had a small party at their house with a chocolate cake that said, "Happy 17th birthday, Ava," in purple frosting. Lucas's little sister taught me how to blow out candles and make a wish, something I'd never done before because birthdays weren't allowed. Mrs. Martinez cried when I took my first bite of cake and actually smiled, said it was the first time she'd seen me look like a real teenager. 2 days later, the FBI agent came by to tell me my testimony had started something bigger than just our case. Congress was drafting new legislation to prevent children from being used as collateral for any kind of debt, medical or otherwise. They were calling it Monica's Law after my mother, and it would make what happened to me a federal crime with mandatory life sentences. At the press conference a week later, I stood at the podium in front of dozens of reporters and told my story one more time. The timing of Robert's crash feels awfully convenient. Right when his transport van hits a barrier, he just happens to have a full confession ready in his shoe. Makes me wonder if someone helped arrange this accident to protect bigger names in the network before he could testify. My voice was clear and strong as I announced the Monica Patterson Foundation, which would help families drowning in medical debt find legitimate help before predators found them. The foundation already had $3 million in donations from people who'd followed the trial, and several hospitals had agreed to partner with us for debt forgiveness programs. After the cameras stopped rolling, I walked outside into the bright Iowa sunshine and took a deep breath of free air. The Martinez family was waiting by their minivan, Lucas holding a bag of takeout from my new favorite restaurant, his sister bouncing with excitement about showing me her school play that night. For the first time in my life, I had a future that belonged to me, not to creditors or contracts or men who saw me as property. I climbed into the van and let them take me home, to my real home, where I could laugh and cry and be seen and remembered and loved. Senior year started 3 weeks later, and for the first time in my life, I walked into school with my head up, looking people in the eyes, wearing clothes I'd chosen myself in colors that weren't gray. The Martinez family had taken me shopping, and I'd stood frozen in Target for 20 minutes just staring at all the choices before Nancy gently guided me toward a blue sweater that made me feel like a real person. I signed up for AP Chemistry and Calculus, classes Robert never would have let me take because they'd make me stand out, and when Mrs. Henderson saw my name on her roster, she actually gasped. The first week I raised my hand 17 times, and every single time my voice came out stronger than before. Lucas sat next to me in English and passed notes that made me smile so wide, my face hurt from using muscles that had been dormant for years. The homecoming dance arrived in October, and Lucas asked if I wanted to go as friends, since neither of us had dates, and I said yes before I could second-guess myself. Nancy helped me pick out a purple dress that swished when I walked, and did my hair in curls that bounced with every movement. At the dance, I moved my body to the music without caring if I looked stupid, threw my head back and laughed when Lucas did a ridiculous robot dance, ate 3 pieces of cake and didn't count the calories, stayed until they turned the lights on and kicked us out. My therapist Jennifer met with me twice a week in her office downtown, where the walls were painted soft yellow, and she never made me sit still if I needed to pace. She taught me breathing exercises for the panic attacks that hit at random moments, like when someone grabbed my shoulder in the hallway, or when I heard a camera click. The nightmares about Robert measuring me slowly faded from every night to twice a week to once a month, replaced by regular dreams about forgetting homework or showing up late to class. One Tuesday, a package arrived at the Martinez house addressed to me. Inside were 7 letters from the other girls who'd been rescued from the trafficking ring. They thanked me for being brave enough to run, for gathering evidence, for saving them from the same fate I'd been heading toward. Maria from Texas wrote that she was back in school and playing soccer again. Ashley from Michigan said she was learning to trust her foster family. Sophie from Oregon mentioned she was seeing a therapist too, and it was helping. I kept all their letters in a shoebox Nancy gave me that I labeled New Beginning in purple marker. College application season arrived, and Nancy sat with me at the kitchen table surrounded by laptops and pamphlets from universities I'd never dreamed of attending. Robert had never planned for me to go to college since I was supposed to be sold before graduation, but now I had choices and a future that belonged to me. I wrote my essay about finding my voice after years of enforced silence, and Nancy cried when she read it. We submitted applications to 12 schools, and I chose pre-law as my major because I wanted to help other girls escape situations like mine. The name change hearing was scheduled for February at the Cedar Rapids courthouse. Judge Whitfield asked if I was certain I wanted to become Ava Martinez instead of Ava Patterson, and I answered yes without hesitation. The Martinez family filled the first 2 rows of the courtroom, and when the judge signed the papers making it official, they erupted in cheers and applause that echoed off the walls. Lucas hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe, and his little sister Maria made a sign that said, "Welcome to the family Ava Martinez," in glitter glue. March 15th was the anniversary of Monica's death, a date I'd calculated from the medical bills I'd found in Robert's office. I bought yellow roses because the cemetery worker said they meant new beginnings, and drove myself to Linwood Cemetery where she was buried. Her headstone was small and simple, just her name and dates, no mention of the daughter she'd left behind. I sat on the grass and read her a letter I'd written about the girl I was becoming, the life she'd missed, the ways her death had shaped everything that came after. I told her about the Martinez family and Lucas, and how I was learning to laugh again. I told told her I understood why Robert had done what he did, even if I couldn't forgive him yet. I left the roses propped against her stone and walked back to my car feeling lighter somehow. Spring arrived, and with it came acceptance letters from 8 colleges, including University of Iowa, with a partial scholarship. I deleted all the evidence photos from the flip phone, watching each image disappear with a sense of finality. The truth was already public. The trial was over. Robert was serving 15 years, and Mr. Gray and his associates were facing federal trafficking charges. I didn't need those pictures anymore because I was building new memories worth keeping. Prom came and went with Lucas and me going as friends again, this time in a group with 6 other kids from our classes. I danced until my feet hurt, sang along to every song even though I didn't know all the words, took dozens of regular photos where I was smiling and visible and real. Graduation day arrived faster than expected, and I stood at the podium as valedictorian, a position I'd earned with straight A's once I was finally allowed to try. My speech was about resilience and chosen families and finding your voice after being silenced, and I made eye contact with the Martinez family in the 3rd row the entire time. When I talked about people who save you without being asked to, Nancy wiped her eyes and Lucas gave me a thumbs up that made me smile. After the ceremony ended and we threw our caps in the air, I hugged every single person who'd helped me become this version of myself. August came with its humid heat and the used Honda Civic I'd bought with money from my part-time job at the bookstore. I loaded it with boxes of clothes that weren't gray, books I'd chosen myself, photos of my new family, and a laptop for the classes I'd be taking at University of Iowa. The Martinez family stood in the driveway waving as I backed out, promising to visit every weekend even though we all knew it would probably be every other weekend once classes got busy. As I drove toward Iowa City for freshman orientation, Cedar Rapids grew smaller in my rearview mirror, but I wasn't running away anymore. I was driving toward a future I'd chosen, a life that belonged to me, classes where I could raise my hand, friends who would know my real laugh, and the chance to help other girls find their freedom the way I'd found mine. Well, folks, that's a wrap on this remarkable little journey we've shared. Appreciate you letting me crack wise while you flipped through the pages. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.